There we are. It's the 10th of May, 1776. If you were walking down Oxford Street in the late morning and you glanced up Argyle Street, you'd have seen where the little red spot is that an auction was about to take place. Next. The auction is being conducted by James Christie, who founded his firm 9.5 years before now, and he's doing very nicely. And that is the actual catalogue that he used. And in it is written what it was sold for and who it was sold to. So it's all the possessions of a man called Anselm Beaumont, who had died earlier in the year at the age of 61, and he was a bachelor. Now, the catalogue is arranged room by room, so we know what the house was like. We know that it was 5 stories, basement, 3 principal floors, and attics. And on each floor, there were 2, there's a front room and a back room, and there were 3 windows wide. So there were large rooms. Right, next, please. Well, I'm not going to tell you all of it, but I'm going to pick up some highlights. So we start with the staircase. Anything which was sold for more than £5, and that would be £750 in today's money, I put in red. So there's a nice clock there. Then we come to the foreparlour, and that's what we would call the current dining room. And there's 3 sets of curtains. We know there are 3 windows, big mahogany, sideboard, and sets of cutlery. The back parlour had a tent bed in it, £5, and not much else. And I'll tell you at the end why I think that room didn't have very much in it. We now go up 1 floor. The front room is the drawing room, and it had rich curtains. It had 8 armchairs, a sofa, mahogany card tables, lots of other things. So it was pretty well full of things. Next. Behind, on the other side, at the back of it, this was his library. He had a very large collection of books, and we have 2 large mahogany bookcases, which was selling for about £1,200, that sort of amount. And then we go up another floor, and we come to the main bedroom. He had a 4-post bedstead with mahogany Gothic feet and chintz cloth, sold for £20. That's £3,000 in today's money. The bed was your most expensive piece of furniture, and that's just the bed, not the furnishings, just the bed. And there were lots of chairs and things. And then opposite, there was a second bedroom. We then come on to plate. He had 24 silver-handled knives and forks and lots of other things, some watches and telescopes and things. Next. He had 3 complete sets of china. One from Dresden, but the other 2 were Chinese. They come all the way out from China, and they would have been very valuable because it was a long way to come and they're easy to break. And there were those other things. And then they sold his clothes. And he had 15 suits, 4 black silk, 2 grey, brown, scarlet gold, brown gold, beaver gold, lead colour gold, sky blue, spotted velvet, and cut velvet. He had some fancy waistcoats, and he had sort of various things like a few daggers and things. And then we come to his linen. He had 140 shirts, 66 of which he had not worn. And they sold for £1 each, £5 for 6 shirts, because the linen was imported and was very, very expensive. And then we got waistcoats, we got his underwear and his various other things. And the total value of the property was £530, and the sale had lasted 2 days. Next. The following week, Christie sold the library. Then there's the catalogue. There were 100 different lots of non-fiction, and then he was very well read. He's got all the standard works in English, in Latin. He's got Homer and Horace and Plutarch, and he's also got quite a few books in French. And then there were the 3 most valuable books were basically what we call coffee table books, great big folio books. They were all about antiquities. The most valuable one was pictures of Herculaneum, and then there was Piranesi's views of Rome, and finally pictures of Palmyra. I'll show you the 3 books. Next. This is the book on Herculaneum. He did visit it. It had been discovered about 15 years before. And people were fascinated by this. Pompeii was a workers' town, but Herculaneum was where the Roman aristocracy had their seaside villas. And people were absolutely because of course all the decorations and things had survived. And people were absolutely stunned at how lavish and beautifully decorated these houses were. So that was extremely interesting. Next, that's Piranesi. It's quite a well-known book, Piranesi's Views of Rome. And next, this is Palmyra, had been rediscovered about 20 years earlier by Robert Wood. He didn't go to Palmyra, but that's the third book that he had. So he's obviously well-read. He's also obviously wealthy. So who is he, and how did he make his money? Next. Right. 61 years earlier, he was born in Newgate Street, just north of St. Paul's. Next. He was baptized on the 4th of January, 1715. His father was Anselm Beaumont, and his mother was Anne, and her maiden name was Pink. Next. Now, his father was an apothecary. At the age of, whatever it was, 16, he was apprenticed to John Hawkins. And in 1716, he went into partnership with his two brothers-in-law in a wholesale druggist business with a total capital of £8,000. And in the history of the Pharmaceutical Society said this was a very large amount of money in those days. He eventually passed his examinations, and in 1719 he became a yeoman of the Society of Apothecaries. And then 7 years later he died. I think he must have died rather suddenly because there's no will, and the children became wards of court. Next. Now, because they were wards of court, an inventory was made of the house they were living in. And this is a much simpler house. It's just 2 rooms downstairs, 2 rooms upstairs, and presumably a shop. And just basic furniture, tables and chairs, nothing like the house which we've just been looking at. The household possessions raised £175. Stock in trade was 3,000 odd. So the gross value was 3,500. But there were large debts to Anthony Kingsley. And the funeral cost £36, 7 shillings and 10p. So funerals were just as expensive then as they are now. But as you can see, they're not in poverty, but they're not rich. Next. Right. So at the age of 15, what did he do? Well, he became an apothecary. His father was an apothecary, and so were both his grandfathers. So in 1730, he was apprenticed to Thomas Graham, apothecary to the George I and George II, and apothecary general to the army. Actually, what it was is that Anselm Beaumont's uncle had married the daughter of the great man. So it was all basically in the family. He did very well. He studied hard, and in 1739, he passed the basic examinations and became a yeoman of the society. Then he went on studying, and he learnt more and more, and he took more and more exams. And I've actually been to the room where he would have taken his exams in the society. And in 1751, he becomes a liverman, which means he knows really all there is to know about drugs. So this is medicines and spices, all sorts of things like that. He's now, I would say, an expert on it. Next. But then it all changes, because we go to the headquarters of the East India Company, and I've looked at the minutes of the directors met every Wednesday, and they have these lovely books this size, bound in white leather, which are the minute books, handwritten, of course, and you can actually handle it. And if we look at the minutes for the 8th of November, 1752, item 2, ordered that Mr. Anselm Beaumont, Mr. James Munro, whose request was read last court, have liberty to proceed to the East Indies as free merchants. There's no connection between the two men, they just happen to write in at the same time. But he's not going out as a member of the company. He's going out with his own capital, and he's going to sell and move stuff around and perhaps send some stuff back to England on his own account. He's an independent businessman out in the Indies, and he's got permission to operate there. But he's not a member of the company. Next. Now, at that time, we're only starting to penetrate India. The East India Company, of course, was founded in 1600 on the west coast, first all a place north of Madras, and then Bombay, and then, of course, there was a big base in Bombay. And then gradually they got round to Madras on the east coast. Then in 1690, they got Calcutta, and they created a new factory there, a new trading establishment called Fort William. And of course, this was a very good place to be because you had access up the Ganges River, which goes diagonally up the map, as well as access along the coast. And they were traders. The company brought out stuff that the Indians wanted, and then they bought lovely things like fabrics and things which sold very well in Europe. So it's basically a trading organization, no more than that. And basically you could go up the rivers, you could go along the coast, but the rest of India, you really couldn't penetrate the jungles. Next. This is a picture of the company's headquarters, Fort William at Calcutta, drawn in 1754. As you can see, it's a magnificent, it was called the Fort William. It's absolutely a magnificent building. And this is where Beaumont would have arrived in 1753. Next. Now, we know he sailed on the Winchester, leaving London in October. And that's what he had with him in the race. He had a case of wine and 4 half cases of wine. He had another case containing his writing desk and books, a trunk of his clothes, some more books. And then in the hold, there were 4 large chests containing coral beads. Now, Mr. George Chandler was his London agent. He was working with him, and he was going to, well, essentially, he would be a Chandler's man out in Calcutta. And of those 4 chests, one of them is labelled AB. So that's his chest, and he's got £500 worth of coral beads. So that's his capital going out to India. And then every year, another shipment of beads would come out from London, as I've shown you there. Next. And this is what it was. This is red coral found in the Western Mediterranean. It's all been dug up now, but in the 18th century, there was plenty of it. It was made into beads, and then those were shipped out to India, and they're used in both for, well, all sorts of things, particularly for jewelry and also used in funerals. So there's a big market for these beads. So that's what he's doing. He's importing that from the Mediterranean and then selling it at a profit to the Indians. Next. Now, you'll all remember from your school days history the siege of the Black Hole and the siege of Calcutta. Suraj al-Dullah has just taken over as the Nawab, or the man in charge of Bengal, from his grandfather. Clive had gone off with the armies, probably fighting the French, so Calcutta was not well defended, and the Nawab attacked Calcutta with a force of 50,000 people. And of course, there was nothing to stop them. He just overran the place, people were put in the Black Hole, etc., etc. Now, fortunately, Beaumont did not get into the Black Hole, but he lost everything he had. Next. Now, before the attack, about 300 civilians, including Beaumont, had formed a militia to join with the 180 soldiers in the garrison, but it was not nearly enough. After the siege, Beaumont was appointed a factor in the company. He's now going to work for the company, and he's one step off the bottom. And the reason was because of his honourable conduct and his great losses in the late general calamity. And then if we read his will, which he made in 1773, one of the requests is £500 to be laid out in rings of equal value, to be given to each of those gentlemen who lent him £1,000 a time at the time of his distress in 1756. So his mates all rallied round and said, we'll lend you £1,000. And one of those mates would have been Robert Clive. Next. So he's now working for the company, and by 1759, he's gone right up to the top. He's now in the highest grade. He's the senior merchant, and he's the provincial military storekeeper. And one of his things he was responsible for was the mint, because the mint had started just a few years before. And he wrote to George Challoner, that's his agent in London, and this is what he wrote. The company have sent out an assay master. A proper person in that station will take off a great deal of trouble from me, as I have always superintended that particular branch, though I find, according to the reports in the Tower, we have not been very accurate in our assays, neither do I believe there is any method yet found out of an absolute certainty in the fineness of money. Now, we do actually have an image of him. Robert Clive is back in England. He's bought Claremont, that large house here in Esher, and he's doing it up as his grand house. And in particular, he's going to have a large dining room with 4 huge pictures, 17 feet wide, 11 feet high, giving the main things in his career. Only one was painted. That was Lord Clive receiving the grant of the Diwani. Next, please. Right, so, and Beaumont was put in this painting. Beaumont was not there. Beaumont was in London. But Clive said, Beaumont's one of my special friends. I want him in my picture. So he's in the picture. He's portrayed as a short, stout gentleman, which is confirmed by a letter that he wrote from England to Richard Barwell to order some shirts. I shall be obliged if you will get made and sent to me 1 dozen of Malta kossars, which cost with you from 7 to 8 rupees the piece, the shirts to be made full 2 cords long and very large, both in the body and in the sleeves. You will remember my rotundity, which is rather increased. Next, that's the picture. It now hangs, it's about 2/3 of the picture. I cut the edges off. It's 17 feet wide, 11 feet high. It takes up a whole wall in Paris Castle. And Beaumont's over on the left, and in the bottom corner, I've blown him up. So that's what he looks like. And you can see he is quite portly, and he's wearing one of his black silk suits. Next, please. Right. This talk is based on his letter book. 2 of his letter books have survived. As I say, this is a very extremely rare thing. The British Library only has 1 similar document, and it only covers a few months. So that's, in this, he would write drafts of his letter, and then he would copy them out and send them off on the ships to send them back to England or to other places in India. And this is a letter which he wrote in April 1763 to Thomas Waters, who was one of the directors. It was resolved to send 2 members of the board in order to confer with the nabob and to amicably adjust all disputes with him. It was likewise determined that a senior servant should attend them and be left behind in the character of resident. This latter I applied for, and being the senior servant in Calcutta, I did not imagine they could refuse me. Mr. Van Sittart, the governor, the very morning before the appointment was made, assured me of his interest and friendship on this occasion, saying at the same time that he should be glad of the opportunity of placing me in a situation that would be agreeable to me. I acquainted him at that time that I had heard and was persuaded that some of the members of the board were inclined in favour of another person. He again assured me of his interest and every argument in his power to recommend me to the board. The next morning came on the appointment, and instead of its being offered, as usual in such instances, to the senior servant, a candidate was proposed and accepted, and it was accordingly put to the vote. The governor and 9 of the council were present, besides which the major of the king's forces and the major of the company's. 5 of the council did me the honour of their votes in my favour, and 4 were against me. And the major of the company's forces, Major Adams of the King's, though much pressed to it, declined giving his vote on this occasion, saying that as there was no military concern, he thought he was not entitled to give his vote. The major of the company's forces, not withdrawing his vote for the same reason, made the voices equal. It then depended on the governor, who being asked for his vote after much hesitation, and how disagreeable it was for him to decide an affair between 2 people, for both whom he had the highest esteem, and who were so equally unexceptionable for the employ, he gave his vote in favour of a person at least a dozen below me in the service. So he was very miffed. But things got better 10 months later in November. Because, slide please, next. At the end of November, he wrote to Richard Gammon, who was another London merchant, a friend of his, "I have accepted of the chiefship of Midnapore, a post, if I was to remain 2 or 3 years, would be very advantageous. However, I do not purpose to be tempted by any emoluments to continue longer than next November." The reason was he'd been very ill the previous year. And at the same time, he wrote to George Challoner, "My appointment to Midnapore was unanimous and unsolicited, and since that the governor has sent his brother to me and invited me to an éclaircissement, when he made so many apologies for his former conduct to me, and that I could not with any decency refuse a reconciliation. However, I told him my sentiments upon it very plainly, but concisely, and finished the conversation by telling him that the less that was said on that subject the better, and we are to be good friends in the future." And that's all one sentence, because they didn't use punctuation. So he's now got a job, but he's only going to stay for a year, because as I said, he's worried about his health. And this is, as I said, this letter book contains a total of 217 letters. Next. Now, this was the man who gave his voting, well, basically chose the other man. That's Henry Van Sittert, a very bright person. He first went out to India, I think, at the age of 13, made a lot of money, came back and squandered, he gambled it away. So then he went back again. One of his attributes was that he could speak fluent Farsi, which is, of course, the language used by the Mughal emperor and the people at the top. So he was a very useful person. He was made governor of Bengal at the age of 24. So this is basically his boss. Very bright, and then he came back to England with Beaumont in 1764. Next, please. Right. So I'm now going to read a few extracts from letters which he wrote to his boss, to Van Sittert. I mean, as I say, his sort of day job, they're building a new fort, a new trading station at Midnapore, which is about 70 miles west of Calcutta, and it's his job to make sure it's built up, and in particular, that it's properly fortified, it can't be attacked. So just a few little bits of little bits taken from those letters. And the first group of letters, the first group are about completing the fort. So in December, he wrote, "The fort, as far as Major Knox left directions, is now near completed. But as it is absolutely necessary to build the ramparts, the curtains, and proper lodgements with all expedition, and as I have nobody here that knows how to direct or superintend that work, I request the favour that you would order a proper person to be sent here, that it may be finished before the next rains. I must likewise request that you would order to be sent here 2 good smiths to complete the ironwork for the gun carriages." Then in March, he wrote, "There was a large magazine under one of the bastions, but by an error in the construction, air holes having been omitted, it is excessively damp, consequently unfit till rectified to deposit any stores in. Mr. Pollier, the chief engineer at Fort William, when he was here, formed a plan of what was necessary to complete this fort, but left me no directions how to process in any part of it. Indeed, he told me that I had no person here proper to superintend the work without commending many errors, but promised to propose to you the sending of Mr. Huggins, whom he could spare, for that purpose, and in expectation of his coming, I have been making bricks and collecting all materials necessary for the proceeding in the business. But as it is now more than a month since Mr. Pollier left Midnapore, and Mr. Huggins not arrived, I am at a loss to know whether I should continue employing so many people as are at present entertained. Therefore, I shall esteem it a favour of your orders, and if you do not approve of the fort being as yet completed, I will discharge a great many, as all the business which poor Major Knox gave directions about is now finished, excepting the esplanade, which had better be deferred till the rains set." And then finally, in May, he wrote, "You will know our danger here better than I can inform you. If the enemy should detach a body of horse to these provinces, it will not be in our power to prevent them ravaging the country. But if it is not considerable, and they do not bring artillery with them, I do not apprehend that they will be able to make any impression on the fort. Mr. Roper tells me that he gave you last month an exact return of the ammunition, which does not amount to above 30 rounds a man, which he says will go but a little way in case we are attacked. Therefore, I should be obliged if you would order a supply immediately and to send us some sergeants, as we have only one here, and it will be impossible for Mr. Roper and him to go through the fatigue of the attention that would be necessary if we are besieged." Now, his concerns about Indian aggression were justified, because in January, he wrote, "The Hakara informs me that he left Cuttack about 10 days ago, and 10 days before that time, there arrived at Cuttack one Bimberjee with 4 Jamalders and 5,000 horse from a place called Samblepore, which, by what I can learn, is about 20 days from Cuttack. And 3 days later, I have been informed that Sheikh Ian Mohammed, Jamalda to the Morbanj Raja, came on the 2nd of January with an armed force and plundered and burnt Rebunia and Fulata, villages belonging to the fort. And on the 4th, the Morbanj Raja himself, with a considerable army, arrived at Almara, and his intentions are said to be keep possession of those places. I have no force here at present to send to Chilasor, nor anyone to conduct a proper party. And in April he wrote, my Munsi was informed Mokam Pandit had marched from Cuttack about a month since with 7,000 horse to the northward, through the jungles, and as some said to Morbanj, and others with an intention to enter these provinces. I was informed about 3 days since by one of my Hakaras that about 5,000 of Schubert's forces were arrived within 3 days of Balasore, and that they intended to proceed to the Morbanj country. The Morbanjers for this month had many of his people assembled about Amara under the pretense of celebrating some marriages, but they have continued very quiet on their own side of the river. And finally, in May, he wrote, I have received your favour of the 10th instant, by which I conclude that we are in no danger of a visit from the northward, but I fear we are not so secure from the southward. So that's one thing to worry about, but most of his time he was being a free merchant. So next, please. Right, salt. Now, India doesn't have any salt mines. All the salt comes from the sea. So there are salt pans around the coast. The water evaporates off, and they dig up the lumps of salt and then distribute it about India. And the East India Company acquired some of these salt pans in, I think 1759. And company officers, because he's now working for the company, so company officers were allowed to basically buy salt and then distribute it up the rivers to India and make a profit on basically moving the salt from the source up to the various cities where it would be auctioned off. And I got a few, he was obviously a very big person in this, so I got a few quotes from what his letters have. There are a total of 17 letters about this. So in May, he wrote to Patrick Campbell at Patna, I wrote to you the 24th instant, enclosing invoices and 2 parcels of salt on my account, but I forgot to send you at the same time a muster of it, which I think very necessary, that you may judge whether it has been mixed with anything in the passage, which I believe is very frequently practiced. And in June he wrote, I had the pleasure of your favour the 5th instant, and wish that with you my salt was safe arrived at Patna, but fear that I shall not soon have that good fortune, as I have sometimes since received advices of the first parcel being arrived at Munga and landed there, and part of it sold. And now I hear that His Excellency has ordered all the English gaolers to be locked up, and not a grain of any Englishman's salt to be sold on any pretence whatsoever. And then in December, in a letter to Stanley Batson, before I left Calcutta, I wrote to you that I should only be able to get boats for about 30,000 maunds. Now, a maund is 80 pounds, so that is 1,000 tons of salt, a lot of salt. And I must depend upon you to engage the rest. I gave orders that as soon as boats arrived, that they would dispatch them to you 10 or 15,000 maunds at a time, in order that I might get as much as I could away before the northwesters set in. And then later in December he wrote, I have received a letter from my Gomestars at Samganj, but very unsatisfactory, as they make no mention of the number of bags they found in the gaolers there, but tell me that they find a considerable deficiency in the weights, and that they have sold part of it at 3 rupees 11 annas the maund. In a few days, I hope my people will dispatch to you about 12,000 maunds of salt, and I shall continue sending as fast as I can get boats. Now, businessmen always say trade's hard. So we get now down to the bottom line. Next, please. And this is what he wrote to John Burdett. Sir, give me leave to make my proposal to you, which is that I will pay you the full money that you have advanced, and a profit of 30 rupees for every 100 maunds, being the 70,000 maunds, that's 2,500 tons, mentioned, which will amount to 21,000 rupees profit, that's about £2,400, on the 15,000 that you have advanced. So the profit is about 140%. And this is a joint thing, so he'll be making the same amount. He's probably, we know he's got at least 3 or 4 other operations with other people. So I think it's quite reasonable to say that he was probably moving 10,000 tons of salt every year and making a profit of £10,000. And there is circumstantial evidence for this. Next, please. East India Company bills. Now, if you wanted to move money, there were no banks, of course. So the best way of moving money was you took your rupees into Calcutta and got a bond. You then sent the bond by sea to England, and the recipient would then take the bond, take it up to Leadenhall, and get the money in pounds. Way of moving money, using bonds. And if we look at the bonds between 1761 and April 1763, he purchased 50. And most of those, they say what they were about, but some of them, 7 of them, just say payable to George Challoner, and they total £10,000. So I think this is £10,000 being sent back to London for his pension. Next, please. What else did he get involved in? Opium. And these are 2 extracts about opium. He's moved to the right place. So while he was still in India, in 1763, he wrote to Roger Carter, "I should gladly accept of your offer of a joint concern in opium, if to be bought at a reasonable price. But it is now advanced here to 750 rupees per chest, and very little to be had, as the whole that has been made this last season in the province of Patna does not amount to 1,000 maunds, and the usual quantity 1 year with another amounted to about 8,000 maunds at the above price." And he wrote to Richard Barwell, "You have done very right," this was in 1765, "you have done very right for Watts in disposing of his opium. That great advantage in that trade is now over, and it must fall in Bengal to its usual price. It would not at present sell for anything here. It would not fetch last year at Macau $400 a chest. Therefore, many adventurers in Bengal, I fear, will be great sufferers, and I hope, and I think and hope that you are not of this number." So he's clearly been operating in opium. Next, please. Now, I've mentioned Richard Barwell. He worked for Anselm Beaumont in Calcutta, and then he took over his post in Calcutta. He is reckoned to be the man who made the most money out of India from trading all sorts of things. It's said that when he came back to England, he had £500,000. That may be an overestimate, but that's a top end of figure which people are given. And as I say, and then when Beaumont came back to London, Barwell was his agent out in Calcutta. Next, please. Right, when he came out, he was selling coral. He's still interested in jewels. He works for all the main jewellery companies in London. There were sort of 3 or 4, mostly run by Jews, and he's operating with them. And here are a few quotations about what he was handling. So the first letter I've got there is to Challoner, and he wrote, "The manufacture of sound coral that I have received from you, I have never had any objection to, but the colours have been lower than should be for this market, and which will always prevent the sale. And as I have often written to you before, you had better leave out the very low colours. Your 2 chests of compound glass remained invendable here. If we have a ship to China this year, I will freight it there on your account." And in December he wrote, "All your pearl and emeralds are unsold. Your lapis lazuli and philosopher's stone I have consigned to Captain Webber, who is going to China." And then in November he wrote to Moses, Jacob and Raphael Franco, who are the leading jewellers in London. He wrote, "I had little hopes of disposing of your string of pearls consigned to Mr. Culling Smith and me. However, I have tempted a gentleman with them who is going up the country and have sold them for sonnet rupees 10,000, which produces neat something more than you limited the proceeds." And let's say the Francos were in fact leading a Jewish family from Portugal. Next, please. And that's Raphael Franco, the head of the family, who was famous for his yellow suits. And this is just a little, this is a little extract. This is something that Horace Walpole wrote to Lady Ossory on the King's birthday in 1780. And he wrote, Walpole wrote, "We had an accordingly pretty firework last night on the bank of the Thames, at that most beautiful of all spots that was Mr. Giles's, and is now one Franco's, a Jew, who gave the entertainment in the order of the day." Next. Now, this is one of his books from his library. It's Jeffrey's Treatise on Diamond and Pearls, published in, I think, 1749. And it tells you everything you need to know about diamonds and pearls. And in fact, it was still the standard reference book up until 1900. And that was a book in his library. Next, please. Now, another thing which sold very well in London were textiles. These were paisley designs, but they were hand-painted on linen. And they were incredibly popular in Europe. So a couple of extracts here. First, a letter to Robert Orme. "In my last of February the 18th ultimo, I advise you of having sent per ship Drake 6 half-pieces of striped dorieres, directed as you desired for Lady Holderness. These, as well as what was sent before per ship Godolphin, I hope will arrive safe with you. Enclosed, I send you the account of the cost of both parcels, and have drawn upon you for the balance amounting to £45, 7 shillings and 2pence, in favour of Mr. George Challoner of London." And he wrote to Charles Borchia, who was the governor of Madras, "I hope long before this the Horton is arrived with you, and that you have received the Susies and bandanas for Mrs. Borchia to take with her. I send you by that conveyance. Sometime since, my friend Pybus wrote me that he should send for you 4 pieces of cloth for me in order to be painted for Palampours, and I shall therefore, when you receive them, you will oblige me much in getting them finished in the best manner, as they are designed for Europe, and you will please to let me have them in time to send them by our early ships the next season." And those are a couple of 17th of the right date, which are in the V&A. Next, please. But he dealt in all sorts of things. This is a letter he wrote to Harry Varels. "I have bought for you 6 half chests of claret, which I tasted yesterday, and I think very good. Wood tells me that he has bought for you 2 whole chests, all which I conclude will be sufficient. If not, let me know. Madeira you must be well stocked with. Joyan has bought with him 30 pipes, the price of which is fixed at 800 rupees. 20 of them have been bought by the army. There is very little beer come this season, and I have only been able to get 1 cask for my family, which Gregory spared to me some bought in his vessel from Madras. Wood says he supplied you a few months since with a large stock, therefore be careful of it. He will take care to provide you with cheese, hams, pickles, and minutiae. If anything in particular you want, inform me, and I will get it for you if possible." And he also mentions things like rice, cloves, cinnamon, balga hides from Russia, cow tails from Tibet, and shellac. Right, next, please. Now, as I said, these are business letters, but you get little bits of news, little bits of social gossip. And the first thing I'm going to read out to you concerns Hugh Watts, who was a bit younger, went out at the age of 15. He worked for Beaumont, and then he took over. He in fact took over as a resident at Midnapore when Beaumont came back to England. And this is a letter he wrote to Varelst in 1763. "Watts was most certainly in a very miserable situation, deeply smitten with the charms of Miss Fenwick, but he received from her sweet mouth a plump refusal, and declined writing that family in order to recover of the wounds he had received. However, within these last 10 days, Hugh has had another interview, and whether, notwithstanding she has many admirers, nothing better has offered, he has, I believe, now obtained permission to pay his addresses in form, and things appear to go on to his satisfaction, and I apprehend it will not be long before everything will be concluded. The World here says that the 2 majors were in the list of swains, and that the company appears somewhat disappointed at the rapid progress of Hugh, who tells me that his future happiness depends upon her smiles. And 6 weeks later, there's another letter. Hugh Watts could not keep Lent, but prevailed upon Miss Fenwick to accept of him of the 27th of March. She is a fine girl, and I hope they will be very happy. They live chiefly at the garden house, which will be very handsome when the upper rooms are finished." And then next, please. Right, this is a second, that's one of two, that's the second of the two letters I'm going to read you. This is, again, a letter he wrote to Challoner in 1763. Miss Hyatt, I understand, comes out on the British King. You may be assured that I shall show her all the civilities in my power, but I am astonished at her relations sending out a young lady to this country without any connections or without any acquaintance that I can find. Such a young lady as Miss Hyatt should have been recommended to the protection of some lady here, for there is no asking anybody here to take her into their family, which must be attended with considerable expense as well as trouble. And Calcutta is not like London, where you can lodge and board in reputable families. The market here is by much overstocked, and the young fellows are not so fond of matrimony as they used, and there are very few of them that have thousands instead of lakhs. We have at present on hand 8 or 9 spinsters of a former importation not yet disposed, and many of this year, I fear, will be disappointed in their expectations. I hope it'll not be Miss Hyatt's case. But fortunately, about 6 months later, he was able to write to Thomas Waters, Miss Hyatt has not much depended on the golden tales she may have heard of Bengal, as she thought proper to engage herself to Captain Pigou before her arrival and was married soon after. Now, a year or so ago, I had a visit from Anna Corsi, who wrote the Fishing Fleet, about women going out to be wed. And she said this was 100 years earlier than anything she'd ever seen. She was fascinated by this. Right, next, please. Right, well, as I said, he had been very ill. He decided he'd only spend a year at Nepal instead of the 3 years when he could have made a lot of money. And he came back in HMS Medway, and they left Calcutta, I think, in December 1764. They called at Madras, Cape of Good Hope, St. Helena, and they arrived in London about June 1765. 6 months was a typical time for an East Indiaman or naval vessel to get back. It's a long way. Anyway, so he's now back in London. He first lived in Bath, and then in February 1766, he took lodgings at a china shop just opposite Grigier's in Pall Mall in London. And in February 1766, he wrote to Richard Barwell, "The great part of my time since my arrival has been passed in the country. 6 weeks at Bath, where are always to be seen many pretty women, but I do not thirst after conjugal joy. It will be a dangerous place for you. Nothing but money is wanting to make old England agreeable. When you are in the way of quitting, do not be in too great a hurry to leave India, for it is not a little will do, especially for those in the connubial way. I have already found out that economy will be very necessary for me in my limited station, as every expense is greatly enhanced. I have taken lodgings in Pall Mall, for which I give 100 guineas a year, and I have built a carriage, but have job horses which cost 100 guineas a year more. This method I shall try for 1 year, by which time I shall discover the inconveniences. It appears to be the easiest for those who are not always in London, which will scarcely be my case, as I still have a propensity to roving, and I have many friends in different parts of the country, and what with visiting them and public places will take up 6 or 7 months of the year. Therefore, I apprehend that lodgings will be more convenient than a house for me, as with the latter I must keep an extraordinary servant or two to take care of it during my absence." And in February, at the same time, he wrote to Hugh Watts, "I am in treaty for an estate valued £30,000 and have only 12 here to pay for it. However, it cannot be brought to maturity before July or August, by which time I hope to have large remittances, and I must raise the rest to make good the purchase if it can be brought to bear. It will produce me 4%. Next, please. And this, I've marked with a little red blob. This was Cheadle Manor and Park, very close to Alton Towers, and he owned it by 1767. And as I say, he doesn't live. This is a buy-to-let property. It makes him 4%. Basically, he can invest, and he makes 4% a year out of it. And by 1768, his financial position was much better, and he took possession of my little cabin in Argyle Street with a fit of the gout, which confined me until February, when I was ordered to Bath, where I received great benefits. That's that big house we started off in. Right, next, please. Now, all was going very well, and then the East India Company said, we're not issuing bonds anymore. So you couldn't just go and pay your money into Calcutta and cash the check in London. So what could you do? And this was totally unexpected. And he wrote to Richard Barwell in November 1766, "You will naturally imagine I must be greatly distressed in not receiving the remittances I expected. And when I left Calcutta, I had no reason to expect this total stop to the company's bills. Consequently, could give no directions for such an event, in which I think the company will soon repent of, as they now begin and will very shortly feel the ill effects of throwing so much money into the hands of the French and Dutch." And in January 1768, he wrote, "I have drawn upon you under £5,000, well, he sent some money through the French East India Company, which is a bit dodgy because England and France were at war. But it did arrive. But everyone else is doing it as well. I mean, there's obviously a shortage of bills, so that wasn't a very good way of doing it. So the second thing he could do was they could buy diamonds in India and bring them back, and they were rough diamonds, they'd be cut in Amsterdam and then go back as polished jewels. And he'd already moved quite a lot of money in diamonds and actually made quite a nice profit. But of course, with everyone chasing the same thing, this wasn't true anymore. He wrote to Hugh Watts, "I find that some attempts have been made to get diamonds with you, what have been sent by the Admiral Watson. However, as I look upon it, the madrassas will esteem you rivals in that branch of business, and it'll make them exert themselves both in quantity and quality, which of course will lower the price of them. I have not heard what the Admiral Watson have sold for, but I believe no more than 2 and 6pence a rupee is expected, which, when insurance, freight, commission, and other charges are deducted, will reduce it to under 2 and 3pence, by which you may tolerably well judge, and when the usual quantities are imported from Madras, the prices from them may be expected to fall at least 10%. So you make a loss if you imported diamonds. But then Barwell came up with a new idea. Next. A Respondentia Bond. Right. If you wanted to move money from Calcutta to Shanghai, you waited until there was a ship going from Calcutta to Shanghai. You then bought a certain proportion of the cargo. The ship sailed. When it got to Shanghai or wherever, that lump of cargo was sold, and that generated the money in whatever, I think, were Chinese dollars then. So this is an easy way of moving money, and you can insure it. It was all very safe. But Barwell came up with a different idea, a camel caravan. The money was moved to Basra, and then he was going to send it by camel caravan all the way to Aleppo. And Beaumont was absolutely horrified. He wrote, "My gardens respond for 10,000 rupees is arrived at Basora, but I do not comprehend how I am to get the money from thence. The usual way, I apprehend, is a sort of respondentia to the merchants who trade by the caravans to Aleppo, which there is no insuring there, and I imagine that sort of trade is attended with some risk, besides the robbers on the desert. And as I understand it, it depends much upon the care of the lender, as these bills are sometimes precarious. And when it does get to Aleppo, I do not know how I am to get it from thence, as there is no constant regular course of exchange between Aleppo and London. And how am I to be advised when it does arrive there?" But it worked, because he had a letter he wrote to Henry Preston, who was the British consul at Aleppo in June 1769. "I have received your favour February the 13th, 1769, and at about the same time the remittance of 7,000 rupees you mentioned by Messrs. Hubsch and Timmins at Constantinople, which bills were accepted and have been regularly paid the amount of £888. And he also managed to move another £300 that way. So it's amazing. He was able to ship money through a caravan. I don't know if anyone else has ever done it. Right, next, please. Now, he never got all his money back. When he died, there was still £20,000 in India. But since he was then dead, that could be moved by a company bond. So that money did get back to England, but not after he died. So we come, what did he do with his money? Well, he had this buy-to-let property, and then he thought, well, I don't understand the stock exchange. I haven't lived in London for long enough. But what I can do is I can lend money to my friends. And those are bills. So the one on this is a bond. It's for £6,000, and it was to Richard Gammon. And half of it was to be paid back in a year, and then the other half would carry on. Then Gammon died. He was bankrupt. Beaumont lost the money. The other bond is for £2,000, and that was paid. But he's, as you can see, he's handing out substantial amounts of money. So I think we can say that, he's not short of cash. Right, then next, please. Right, then we're coming more to the end of his life. As I said, Robert Clive had bought Claremont in Surrey and wanted to, there was this big grand house, and he wanted to furnish it. Where did you go to buy furniture and paintings? You went to Italy. So off they go to Italy, and Beaumont and Clive, well, as I say, so in November, Beaumont wrote to Richard Barwell, I am going abroad in a few days to Italy, where I shall probably be absent for 5 or 6 months to escape harsh weather and to procure works of art for the new house at Claremont. And Clive also had with him Thomas Kelsall, who was also in the big painting, and William Patoun, who was a Scottish connoisseur, to help select pictures and fine furniture. And they visited Paris, Milan, Florence, Rome, Naples. Then they came back through Rome, Bologna, Venice, and Geneva, and they got back to England in May 1774. And as you know, very sadly, only a few months later, Robert Clive was dead, probably by suicide, but we don't know. So next, please. So these, while they were out, Lady Clive was left in London. And there was a regular correspondence backwards and forwards between the travelling party and Lady Clive. And the letters that she received are now held in the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth, so you can go off and look at those. And these are some extracts from the letters which she received. The first extract is a letter written by Anselm Beaumont. They were in Paris. They went to the theatre, and they went to see Anne Heidel, who was a very famous dancer at the time. And this is what he wrote. How much we were delighted at the opera last night. We were placed in the amphitheatre among the ambassadors. My rotundity, to be sure, was not much considered, as it ought to have been for my ease, as the master of ceremonies fixed me on a bench 1 of 5, which would not with propriety contain more than 4, and my being at the end, I had not more than 6 inches of the bench to sit upon. But worse was to come. They had to cross the Alps. In those days, there weren't tunnels. What you went is you drove up the valley, the road gave up, they took the carriage to pieces, and porters would carry the bits of carriage and the luggage, and the passengers would be carried in baskets over the top of the pass, down to the other side, and it would all have been put together again. And the pass they went over was Mount Cenis, which is the pass between France and Italy. Next. And that shows you that's how the passengers were carried in those baskets. And this is what Lord Clive wrote to Lady Clive when they got to Turin. Each of us had six bearers, Beaumont excepted, who had 8. The bearers came to survey us before they undertook to carry us and expressed some astonishment at Beaumont's size. And I overheard one of them say, in ascending the mountain, it is impossible to carry this fat ox up to the top. In short, all the other bearers were called upon in turn to take a spell. Oh dear. So he obviously was very large. Anyway, we've now coming to the end. Next, please. Right. Again, I didn't find this out until later, but Beaumont had actually done some shopping himself in Italy, and he'd bought 24 Roman sculptures. And these were sold, as you can see, halfway down it says, collection of statues owned by Beaumont and so on Beaumont. So people knew he had these statues and obviously visited him to see them. And there were 24 of them, and they sold for just over £200. And those are the 3 things which made the most. Beaumont, in fact, had paid over £400 for them, The problem was nobody else was really collecting Roman statues. It was a new thing. I mean, if they kept them for a few 20 years, they might have got much better prices. So they didn't reach as much. But anyway, they were sold there, and those were they. And next, please. Now, the expert on Roman sculptures in England was a man called Charles Townley, and he made a catalogue of all the main collections, which I put down the side. There's a collection, there's Mr. Brown's Wimbledon, Mr. Barwell, Castle Howard, and then there were the ones at Petworth. So he was in with the other collectors were great people, were people who had great collections. So I think probably his statues are also very good. Now the picture shows Charles Townley in his sculpture gallery. So he had a room, and people could knock at the door and say, can I come and see your sculptures? And I think the room at the back on the ground floor, which was only partially furnished, was where Beaumont had his sculptures. And you could knock on his door and say, can I come and look at your sculptures, please? I don't know for sure, but I think that's why that room was rather empty. So, anyway, now we come to his death in 1776. Next, please. That's his will. Very substantial amount of money. Big things. In particular, £10,000 to his first cousin, and the residue to the son of his first cousin. And so we sort of tot all that up. And there's certainly £50,000 out there when you sort of amortize the various things. But if we look at it a different way, we can say, well, his buy-to-let house was £30,000. He had £20,000 left in India. He was busy handing out, thousands of pounds in bonds to his friends. I think he had at least £70,000 and probably rather more. Certainly, when he gets referred to by other people in India, they say, Mr. Beaumont was wealthy. So we'll say at least 70,000. In today's money, that's £10 million. So he started off with £500. He made £70,000. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end. Actually, if we can just quickly go through. Next. Those are some of the references I've used. Next. This is a thing I wrote for the British Library. I think John has the details of it, but it's a little short article which summarizes what I've been talking about. And finally, next. Right, that's his family tree. You can see him over there on the left in bold. As I say, both his father and son Beaumont was a druggist, and both his grandparents were John Beaumont and William Pink. There was a large gift. He had no children, so he gave 10,000 to his cousin immediately to the right, but most of the money went to that cousin's son, who had been an army officer in the East India Army. Right, I'll just leave that up so you can look at that. Anyway, I can take questions now if you would have me.
Thank you. I'll go and get
Yes, sorry, it's taking a little longer than usual because I haven't been able to press the button.
Right. Okay then.